Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. In today's video, I'm doing some vintage style thrift flips. For my first project, I'm going to be working on this little MDF fake iron. I saw a picture on Pinterest that I wanted to replicate, so I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Pine Cone chalk paint and Saltwash. I'm going to measure out some Pine Cone chalk paint. I've already stirred that really well, and I'm adding that to a plastic container, and then I'm going to start adding some scoops of the Saltwash. Now, I do want the mixture to be a little bit thicker because I actually do want to create a lot of sort of lumps and bumps and texture to simulate rust and age that you might find on metal or iron. I'm going to stir my mixture really well, and then I'm going to start applying it to my project using a chip brush. It's definitely a good idea to use a chip brush here because the Saltwash can be a little bit hard on the bristles. So as you can see, I am dabbing and stippling that on. Now, in the previous video that I did where I used Saltwash for the first time, I went back and brushed down the peaks that I created, but I'm not going to do that this time. Remember, I want this to look like rust, like a build-up of age on an old cast iron. So I definitely want to maintain the texture that this Saltwash is creating. So I'm going to apply the mixture over the entire piece, top and bottom. When the pine cone mixture was dry, I took out a darker brown chalk paint that I had already mixed with Saltwash, and I'm going to be dabbing that on as well. Obviously, rust doesn't just appear in one tone. Often we have a mix of browns and reds in real rust. So I'm definitely keeping that in mind, and I'm going to add this extra brown tone, hopefully to give it a bit more of a realistic look. So I'm just going around again, dabbing that on to create that texture and also getting the bottom of the iron as well. When my paint was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Aquamarine chalk paint. This is a lovely bright blue-green tone. I've poured some out into a cup. Then I'm going to add a little bit of the Saltwash, but this time I'm just doing it to thicken up the paint. I only want to do one coat, so I'm going to go in and start applying that. And you can see that the brush is skipping over the top of the lovely texture that we created, and the effect really is quite a realistic, rustic look. I'm going to continue adding this over the entire iron, and in most cases I am only going to go over it once. I didn't go back and add a second coat. I really liked how the Saltwash looked underneath that aquamarine, and I loved the contrast of the rustic look with that bright color. It sort of reminded me of vintage enamelware. As I said, I saw a picture on Pinterest that inspired me, and I just had to try and recreate it here, and I am loving how this is looking. I definitely think it's quite realistic looking, but you let me know if you think that this looks like realistic rust. As I said, I loved the contrast with the rustic look with the bright bluey green tone of aquamarine. But if this was a bit too much for you, obviously you could come in with perhaps a sort of vintage white or a cream tone if that was going to be a bit more in keeping with your home decor. Once I finished adding it to the handle, I of course added it to the bottom of the piece as well. And then I took out Paint Couture's light brown sugar antiquing glaze, and I'm going to really work that into all of the texture that was created by the Saltwash. And obviously there's a little bit of texture from the paint as well because we did thicken that up. And you can see that I'm wiping back some of the excess there, but really allowing it to sit down in the grooves. And I honestly feel like this again is creating quite the authentically aged look. Now, if you don't have access to glaze, you could create a brown paint wash with some water-based paint and water. You could use a brown wax as well. You could go in the opposite direction and come in with a white wax and make it look a bit more oxidized. It just depends what look you're going for. And here's a look at our finished project. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I think it would look great in any vintage style vignette, and it definitely doesn't look like MDF anymore. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For my next project, I'm going to be working on this black metal basket that I thrifted. I'm going to be taking out one of JRV's grain stencils. I will put the link for those in the description below, and I'm just going to be using the text up the top on the label that's already on my basket. I'm going to add some masking tape to hold it in place. This is a curved surface, so it can be a bit tricky to hold that and also do my next step. I'm going to take out Paint Couture's Embossing Medium and a palette knife, and I'm going to start running that embossing medium over the top of my JRV stencil. And ultimately, I wanted this to look like an old French industrial basket that had an old sign or advertisement rather for a business, and that this has gained age over time. I want it to look really rustic and worn, so adding this I felt like would add to that look. So I'm going to continue adding the embossing medium over the top of this, and I'm not worried about it sticking. The embossing medium sticks pretty well to most surfaces, so I didn't feel like I needed to prime this at all. And then once I'm happy with how that's looking, I'm going to pull that back, but I did just sort of hold the stencil in place until I had the tape from one side off, and then I pulled it up. I let that dry completely, and then I came in with that pine cone and Saltwash mixture we used in the first project, and as you can see, I am dabbing and stippling that onto the label first. Now my embossing medium is dry. Definitely make sure that you wait for that to dry first. But I'm going to go over the top of that. Again, we want this to look really rustic and vintage, so I'm imagining that this label has rusted over time. Maybe you can't see the lettering as well, it's worn away, so I'm adding it there first, and then I'm going to start adding it to the wire of the basket itself. And the good thing about Saltwash is that it does stick to most surfaces really well and really easily. So I'm dabbing this on, and the texture of the Saltwash on that wire is definitely looking like it's gone rusty. It's a really great effect, and the color obviously is definitely helping with this effect as well. So I'm going to work my way around the basket, adding that, doing that dabbing and stippling motion. And I'm also going to have to repeat the same motion, obviously, at different angles on the basket and obviously on the inside as well. So I'm just going to work my way around, adding that pine cone and Saltwash mixture over the entire piece. I've always had a love for baskets, and especially baskets that have some rust and some age, but they can be a little bit tricky to find. And then you also have the added issue of the rust going on whatever you put in there. So this is a really great compromise. You're getting that rustic look without having to worry about the rust actually coming off on the items that you're putting in there. So I'm going to continue adding the Saltwash mixture over the entire piece, and then I let that dry for several hours. You want to make sure it's really stuck on there really well. Of course, I did the bottom too. And then I took out Cozy Beige, and this has already been mixed with some Saltwash. This is some that I had left over, and I'm just brushing that over the top of the dry mixture that we've already put on there. And there'll be times when I brush it on, times when I dab it on. I'm really just having a play here, working out what I like and what looks realistically aged and vintage. And I'm also then going to move on to the rest of the basket, so going over the top of that dried pine cone mixture, but I'm going to allow the brown paint underneath to show through, because again, we want this to look rustic, and obviously rust occurs at different rates. There's going to be some areas that are going to look rustier than others, and honestly, I was just so happy with how realistic this looked. I'm going to continue adding this to the entire basket just like I did before, but again, I do not need full coverage. We want to see some of that brown peeking through. I kept with the pretty neutral creamy white here over the top, but you could create a green and blue patinaed look using this technique for sure. You could adapt the colors to go in a different color scheme. I just went with a classic look here, but this is definitely a technique that you can customize to whatever your look and style is. Once my paint was completely dry, I took out the same JRV stencil that I used with the embossing medium, and I'm placing it over the top of the raised stencil. I did start off using some more of that dark sort of chocolatey chalk paint there over the top, but in the end I decided that this wasn't enough contrast for my liking. It kind of blended in with the background a bit too much, so I actually ended up going in and wiping a bit of that off with a wet wipe, and I took out Paint Couture's pitch black chalk paint instead. So I'm just using a little artist brush here because I don't need it to be perfect, not going for full coverage here, and I am just going over the top of that stencil, just taking my time, adding that pitch black over the top of our raised stencil. I went with a stencil for my design on the label of this basket, but you could definitely use stamps instead of a stencil, or you could use transfers if you're not feeling overly confident about doing that. You can just add a transfer on top, or you could even do some decoupage. There are so many options with a craft like this. When I got down to the bottom section of the design, I did end up adding a little bit more paint outside of the area that I had used with the embossing medium. I ended up going back and wiping that off with a wet wipe. It just felt a bit too crowded. I also went in with that wet wipe before my paint was completely dry, and I took back a little bit, or pulled back a little bit more of that black, so again it looked distressed and worn. Finally, I sealed my entire project with Rust-Oleum's Clear Matte Sealer. And here's a look at my rustic basket. I'm really pleased with this. I haven't tried this technique before, and I really do feel that it looks authentically aged. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. For my final project, I'm going to be working on this wooden caddy. This was quite heavy and really well made. It was quite chunky as well, so definitely good for a bit more of a sort of farmhouse industrial look. It did have a little bottle opener attachment on the side, so I am going to remove that. I don't need that for the purposes of this caddy. I'm going to take out a mixture here that I used in a previous video. This was basil and Simply White chalk paint by Paint Couture mixed together, and I also added Saltwash to it. I covered it over with cling wrap, and as you can see, it's still good, so I'm really excited that that didn't go to waste. I'm going to be using that today. I did end up adding a little bit more of the Simply White, however. I wanted to lighten up that green, also make it go a bit further, and then I do end up grabbing just a bit more of that Saltwash to add again to thicken it up and to give it some texture. I'm definitely going for a vintage look with today's projects, so adding the Saltwash is definitely going to help with this. So I'm going to stir it really, really well, and then I'm going to start applying it to the caddy, and I'm using a chip brush again. And instead of doing that sort of dabbing and stippling motion, I'm actually just brushing it on really thick. There might be some areas where I do have to do some dabbing to get into the little holes there, like the screw holes. I do want to cover those, but I do end up going back over the top and lightly dragging my chip brush over the top of that really thick paint. This tote, or this caddy, had a lot of texture from the wood. You could see it was made from all different types of wood. It was a really lovely rustic handmade piece, and I kind of wanted to pay homage to that. I wanted to just sort of follow the direction of the wood grain and make it look like just really old thick paint that has been on there for a really long time. And the beauty of the Saltwash is that it thickens that paint up, and you're able to maintain those brush strokes, and it just goes on just so nicely. So no dabbing or stippling for the majority of this piece, just really laying that on thick. And I only had to do one coat here, so I'm definitely having a lot of fun with Saltwash. It's making my paint go so much further. It's making it a lot quicker for me to do my projects as well, not as many coats needed. And I am just going to continue to work my way around applying this lovely light sort of sagey green over the entire piece. On the side of this caddy, I could see that they had used a chipboard type of material just on the edge there. So the Saltwash really helped to sort of blend this in a little bit better with the rest of the timber that was used. I kept the tote just one color this time, but obviously this is definitely a project that you could customize. You could come in with a second color, maybe a white, and do that on the handle. I really enjoy doing these projects on caddies because they are just so versatile and so fun. It's definitely something that I pick up at the thrift store whenever I can find them. When I finished the top section of the caddy, obviously I also painted the bottom. I then took out my hairdryer, and I am actually going to speed up the drying process here because I found that because of how thick I put the paint on and the Saltwash, I actually got some really wonderful cracks. So it sort of simulated really thick cracking paint. So that was a lot of fun to experiment with. I definitely recommend that you give that a try. When the paint was completely dry, I took out some 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to go around the edges of the wooden caddy and pull back some of that paint to show the wood underneath. Now this was really stuck on there really well, so I do end up switching over to an 80 grit sandpaper shortly, especially on the areas where I really laid the paint on really thick on those side wooden rungs there. And I'm just loving the vintage look that this is achieving. I didn't go overboard with it, just a little bit of distressing. And you can see here the cracks that we managed to achieve by speeding up that drying process of the thick Saltwash mixture. It was definitely worth the extra effort. I then took out Paint Couture's light brown sugar glaze, and I'm going to go over the top of the entire project, really working it into the cracks that we created by speeding up that drying process. And obviously the texture of the Saltwash and the texture of the wood, we're just really going to try and highlight that and emphasize that with this glaze, working it in and then using a wet wipe to pull it back from the high points. Obviously this is a personal choice. I want this to have a vintage and worn look, so glaze is definitely something that I reach for to achieve that. It definitely gives that aged appearance. If this was too much for you, obviously this is a step you could leave out, or you could come in with a paint wash or maybe a white wax if you wanted to go in the opposite direction and make it a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to continue to add that glaze and really highlight all of the texture we created, and I'm applying it over the entire piece. Not too heavy. Light brown sugar is a really nice sort of in-between glaze. It's not too dark, but I definitely do want to bring that age to this piece. Once the glaze was completely dry, I took out IOD's Mercantile Stamp, and this is the Dry Goods Co. design, and I'm using IOD's white permanent ink, and I'm inking that up really well. When you go over the top of paint, it's definitely a good idea to have a little bit more of that ink on your stamp. I'm lining that up on one side in the center, and then I'm pressing it down. I am using a thin mount, so the grid lines can be pretty helpful here, and I'm just running my fingers over the top of the design, not pressing too hard, but enough to get good contact, and then pulling it up. I ended up then turning the tote over, and I decided that for this side I would do a different design, and it's just the number 7 design. I just thought it would be fun to have two options with two different designs, and just repeating the same process, pressing it down, making sure I've got good contact, and then pulling it away. I also then decided to take out the same white ink pad, and I'm just going to go around some of the edges, make it look like maybe this was painted white at some point and some of that green paint has been pulled away to reveal that. This is definitely a really fun technique and quite an easy way to add just that other layer of age and interest. I'm not going too heavy, I'm not going on every surface, just want a hint of that white. And I then decided to take out a wet wipe because I didn't want it to be too intense, too much contrast, and I just pulled back just a little bit of that just to fade it just a little bit so that it wasn't super obvious. And here's a look at our finished caddy. This was a really fun project, and I definitely enjoyed experimenting with the Saltwash mixture in different ways. And I also loved to be able to use the 2 different IOD stamps, so you can flip it around if it's on a shelf or on the table and get different looks. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. I really hope that you've enjoyed today's video and that it's given you some ideas on how you can take your thrifted finds and turn them into vintage style treasures. Let me know if you had a favorite project from today. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, comment, and share it out. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of our videos. You can find most of the products used today on our website, theprovincialfarmhouse.com.au. Thanks for watching.